Hello everyone, it is Jessalyn and welcome back to my channel. Today, as the name suggests, we are looking at the making of an American hurricane. We are considering hurricanes from multiple different angles, including a scientific, theological actually, so scientific, theological, and historical lens today. I'll go over briefly about a preview of what I'm going to talk about in order so you have an idea. We will begin with the study of prehistoric hurricanes, particularly the scientific research going on right now that is trying or attempting to identify prehistoric hurricane patterns and the corresponding ocean or sea level temperatures and CO2 presence to determine or create a kind of analog or a way to predict how warming ocean temperatures will affect our hurricane seasons going forward. So we'll think about that first. Then we will move on to how hurricanes in the US are actually named. You may have noticed, if you've ever paid attention to weather patterns in other parts of the world, that they're not called hurricanes when they have these massive storms. They're called cyclones or typhoons. And that is because our region is the only region that calls these massive storms hurricanes. And that is due to the Mayans. We get that name from the Mayan god Huracan, or heart of sky. So we'll talk about where we actually got the name hurricane, and it gives me a sense of regional pride in a way, because we'll actually return to the Popol Vuh, because that is where Heart of Sky is. That's where he lives. That's where Huracan lives, right? So we will think about Huracan and why we have named these powerful storm systems after a Mayan god. After that, we will consider some primary texts. I don't have the primary text, unfortunately, but little brief snippets of history coming from settlers from as far back as Columbus, who encountered hurricanes for the first time. We'll think about societies like Isabella, early colonial societies that were completely wiped off the face of the earth due to hurricanes. And so our whole kind of trajectory of civilization has been in a large part defined by weather patterns. We like to think that we are in control of everything, but whether the French were here or the Spanish were there has so much to do with where the hurricanes were blowing at the time. So we'll think about that. We can kind of see from that vantage how small and ultimately victims of fate we really are when we look at that history of hurricanes. So hopefully we can start to look at our own time period and our own engagement with these hurricanes with a similar vantage, imagining how it will look from the future, looking back on this time. Following that, we will move on to 20th century United States, working our way all the way up to Katrina, and thinking about what all of this research, all of this history means for a time in which our hurricane activity has increased by double, right? So since 1980, we are seeing double the number of Category 3 or higher hurricanes, which is a huge number. The reason that I want to speak on, or I wanted to research this, because before this video I knew literally nothing about hurricanes at all. I just knew when water hot, hurricane big. That was the only thing I really understood, was because of Hurricane Helene, which took away the places that I have loved the most in my life. It took away Lake Lourdes, so much of Lake Lourdes. It took away the Flowering Bridge, where I have gone so many times. It took away Chimney Rock, took away Asheville, it took away Black Mountain. And of course these places will rebuild, but they'll never be the same. And they'll never have the sense of stability that they had before. A confidence in their own ability to remain, a confidence in their infallibility or their immortality. We so often think about the world that we live in will remain. We may go, but the landscape will be there once we're gone. The idea that we are outliving our own homes, is backwards, right? The home is supposed to exist after us. We're not supposed to be outliving the land that we live on. That is backwards, right? That doesn't make sense. It's like outliving your children. It's just not right. It's hurricanes and the rising hurricanes, or the rising size of hurricanes, the power of hurricanes, is affecting our concept of home. Whether home can last, whether we can count on home being there. When you buy a house, it may not last long enough for you to pay off your mortgage. It might not last long enough for you to live in it when you retire. We just don't know anymore. It's the erratic nature of things that makes life unpredictable. And when things are unpredictable, it's hard to believe that you have a home, a place where you are safe. So Helene took away homes for so many people. It took away lives for so many people. But it took away a home for me. I didn't live there, but it was a place that I considered part of myself. And I would visit Black Mountain whenever I had the chance. So that is why I wanted to take this moment to investigate what are these hurricanes, right? And so we'll think about hurricane, and the history of this region and its relationship to hurricanes in the past. The goal, of course, is to understand how in the future we can predict and we can contend with the realities of increasing hurricane damage from hurricanes that are slower and hurricanes that are wetter as CO2 levels rise. So to start, let's think about what is the language we use to talk about hurricanes. I have a whole bunch of notes that I'm just gonna show you here. This is all we're going through. Oh my gosh. So much. But before we get to that, we need to think about what is just the basic terms that we use when we discuss hurricanes, because I'm going to be using them. And if you're like me, you've heard people talk about category 1s and 2s and 3s all the time, and you've never really known what that means. Like I didn't. So we're just going to go over that really briefly. We have here a little rundown. Storm Category 1. Category 1 is going to have winds from 74 to 95 miles per hour, a storm surge of 4 to 5 feet, and minimal damage. Category 2 is going to be at 96 mile per hour to 110 mile per hour winds, surge of 6 to 8, moderate damage. These are our most common storms, right? We can predict these pretty well because so many have occurred that we've gotten to the point where we can predict patterns. The issue becomes when you have rare storms. Rare storms are harder to predict because we have less data on them. So a category 5 is so rare that predicting them is pretty difficult to do. Not being able to predict them leaves us open to devastation, right? So prediction is essential. We can predict these. Insurance companies are ready to dole out money for these because they're prepared for them. They set aside the money for them. We get into 3, 4, and 5. Suddenly it's getting harder and harder to see when these hit, what kind of damage they can do, and why. A category 3 is put at 111 to 130 mile per hour winds, 9 to 12 storm surge, and extensive damage. A category 3 hurricane like Katrina, however, did not act like a category 3 hurricane when we think about its storm surge. The levees in New Orleans were built in the 1960s based on the assumption that New Orleans would never be hit by a Category 5 hurricane. And to some extent, they're correct. New Orleans has never been hit by a Category 4 hurricane. In fact, only 4 hurricanes have ever made landfall in the U.S. as a Category 4. I'm sorry, a Category 5. So those engineers were correct. What they didn't understand was that a Category 3 hurricane could have a storm surge way beyond what a Category 3 is supposed to have. And that storm surge could threaten and destroy levees that were built to handle this kind of hurricane storm surge. They didn't realize or predict the ways in which a Category 3, what was, of course, a Category 5 in the Gulf before weakening to a Category 3, could bring with it the amount of water we might expect from a Cat 4 or Cat 5, right? So those predictions equal what we build. So a lot of the prehistoric research we're looking at is attempting to understand these Category 5s so we can accurately predict them, because we just don't have the history. Like I said, 4 hurricanes have made landfall as Category 5s. Only 4. We'll talk about what those are, right? 1935, a Category 5 hurricane makes landfall in Cedar Key, Florida. It's called the Labor Day Hurricane because obviously it happened on Labor Day. I spelled it the British way. Labor Day Hurricane makes landfall in Cedar Key, Florida. It had an 18 to 20 foot storm surge. So we actually saw that Category 5 storm surge in 1935. Obviously, we don't have the technology back then to really understand why it happened. You'll notice it doesn't even have a name. It's just named the Labor Day Hurricane. That is because we did not start naming hurricanes by, at first, female names, because that did not happen until 1950. Okay? The practice began during World War II. So much of what we do in this country has to do with military events, or had military reasoning behind it. In World War II, people in the military were trying to communicate, or meteorologists were trying to communicate with military pilots and military ship crews about hurricanes to obviously protect them. But when multiple hurricanes are happening at once, how do you communicate? It's difficult. So they were given different names, and these these people in the military would name these hurricanes they were tracking after their girlfriends. So they began with female names. I guess it was kind of a joke. You're thinking about your girlfriend as a terrifying storm. That's what it was. But this did not really become codified as a practice until 1953 with our first female storm, Hurricane Alice. It was our first officially named lady storm. Hurricane Alice. In 1979, we added male names, and so currently we cycle through names. That means that hurricanes, their names will reappear, unless they are such catastrophic hurricanes, right? Catastrophic damage, that their names are taken out of rotation. It would be too shocking to hear of another Hurricane Katrina coming, right? Katrina has been retired as a name. Also are some other Cat 5 names like Hurricane Camille, our second Cat 5. She hit in 1969. Hurricane Camille intensifies in the Gulf before hitting Bay St. Louis in Mississippi at a Cat 5 level. She had a 24-foot storm surge. Massive. It's taller than most people's houses. That 24-foot storm surge flattened almost everything on the Mississippi coast, just reshaped the coast. And so that is currently a retired hurricane name. You will never hear of another Hurricane Camille coming. 1992, we meet Hurricane Andrew. This what happened in Andrew. I don't remember. Let's look at the notes. One of the most devastating hurricanes to hit South Florida. 65 died, close to 61 billion in damage as we would see it today. And oh, this is a fun fact. In Bayou La Fourche, 187 million freshwater fish were killed. So we don't think about almost ever the natural victims or the animal victims and wildlife victims of these hurricanes, but there is a clear statement. Bayou La Fourche, 187 million freshwater fish. That's a ton of fish killed by that hurricane. How? I don't know. Okay, that's Hurricane Andrew in 1992, and then 2018 is the closest in past Category 5. Hurricane Andrew is our 2018 hurricane in Florida. So some of us may remember these. No one remembers 1935, I'm sure, but 1969, Camille, we may remember her. Definitely will remember Andrew. I didn't write down his name. Andrew, and likely, oh, sorry, this is Hurricane Michael. Oh, I messed stuff up. I'm sorry. Hurricane Michael. Hurricane Andrew, 1992. Certainly we remember this one. Some might remember this one. That is actually when I was born. I was born in 1992. So that's Hurricane Andrew. Okay, so this is how we talk about it, right? Hurricane in Category 1 and Category 2 are common enough over the past 150 years that we can predict them. But a hurricane number 5, Cat 5, only 4, really hard to predict. So that brings us to prehistoric times. So let's transition now into prehistoric hurricanes and how we can predict them. Okay. So we'll begin with this article here called The State of the Planet, or From State of the Planet, which is news from the Columbia Climate School. This article is about ancient ocean sediments that reveal an analog to human influence warming. And we're going to compare this to another article coming from the Woods Hole National Oceanographic Institute, or Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, which is in Woods Hole, Cape Cod, a place that does a lot of research and has looked into some of the large hurricanes that have hit New England. So I'm going to get those notes out as well. So let me find those notes for us. So we're ready to look at those. Here we go. So here's our notes from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and these will combine. Okay. So, ancient ocean sediments reveal analog to human-influenced warming. Between 59 million and 51 million years ago, Earth experienced dramatic warming periods, both a gradual one stretching millions of years and more sudden spikes known as hyperthermals. This is what we're looking at, is these hyperthermal periods which occur over thousands to tens of thousands of years. So not stretching millions of years, that's more gradual warming, but these sudden warming periods. Now, we do not see a sudden warming period that is 170 years long, right? That is the advent of industrialization. All right, our warming period, if we consider it a hyperthermal, is about 170 years long. A lot smaller than thousands and tens of thousands of years, right? So that's what's unique about our period of environmental warming, is how quickly it is happening due to this industrialization. So scientists agree that higher temperatures are driven in large part by increases in carbon dioxide, and that means that these hyperthermals in this prehistoric past, millions of years ago, were also caused by rising CO2. of course, that rising CO2 was not caused by humans, but was caused by something different, which I had never known about until now, which is deep ocean cycles for the most part. We think about water cycles above the sea, but we don't think oftentimes about water cycles below the sea, and how water is actually pulled into the Earth's crust and as far down as the Earth's outer core. So water does actually get pulled down into those lower portions. And so I'll go briefly to show you how that happens. And that is how, for the most part, CO2 is either released into the atmosphere or taken out of the atmosphere through oceans and their behaviors. So hyperthermals were largely influenced by these deep ocean cycles, most likely, which is what caused all of the different fluctuations in CO2. A deep ocean cycle takes about 1,000 years. Right, so it can take the CO2 out for about 1,000 years, and then we'll release it back into the atmosphere through largely volcanic activity, so lava, so on and so forth. But I've gotten ahead of myself. Okay, so sea surface temperatures have been paired right with the atmospheric CO2 during these times. And this is the central argument of this research, is that CO2 emissions during two ancient hyperthermals were similar enough to today's human-driven emissions that they can help scientists refine models of how fast climate will warm in the future. So this article is showing us how do CO2 emissions relate to a warming climate, but more importantly, warming seas. And the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute then relates those warming seas to larger hurricanes. Okay, so that's why I have both of them here. Dustin Harper, a researcher at the University of Utah, says, the main reason we are interested in these global carbon release events is because they can provide analogs for future change. Okay, what they use to discover what the CO2 was like at this time was through these tiny little shells. Okay, here's a picture of them. These are little foraminifera, little shell organisms found at the bottom of the sea. And in their shells, we can analyze, or the scientists, not me, can analyze the composition of elements and determine what CO2 levels were like at the time. Okay, so this is what we're getting all of this data from, these itty bitty little foraminifera. And this is seen under a microscope, so this is really, really, really tiny, right? And very strong, like a digital microscope too. Okay, so let's go and think about this deep ocean cycle and how it caused these CO2 rises, or rising in CO2. So the deep water cycle is an exchange of water with the mantle of the Earth. It's water carried down by subconducting oceanic plates, returning through volcanic activity. So some water makes it all the way to the lower mantle, reaching even to the outer core. And when it is pulled down, that carbon is stuck down there too. So the carbon is literally pulled from the Earth's atmosphere down into the crust and deep into, all the way again to that outer core. So several oceans worth of water can be contained deep within the mantle, and can be stored for about 1,000 years before it is then released back. So when these kind of what are called hyperthermal events are occurring, it's largely because of increased volcanic activity related to tectonic plates and the movement of oceanic plates. So you're having more lava, you're having more volcanic activity that is releasing carbon back into the atmosphere from those deeper pockets of water. At the start of the industrial age, again, 170 years ago, our CO2 levels were at 280 parts per million. Now they are up to 420 parts per million. It will double in the next 3 to 5 decades to 560 parts per million if nothing is done. I'm not confident anything will be done, so probably it will double. So we don't know how long a 9+ degrees Fahrenheit of warming will occur, because all of these different cycles, deep water cycles, all of these things, they're new. We can't predict them, right? You can't predict things that you have no concept or no past to go on. So we don't know how long that will take, especially when we think about how a full deep ocean cycle takes 1,000 years. What we do know, though, through research, is that when you have these high CO2 levels, you have massive storms. And that is what Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute has determined by looking at sediments in lakes in Cape Cod, in the Cape Cod area, and others, obviously. But in a Falmouth pond, they were able to find sediment from the ancient seas that had been pushed all the way from the coastline into the inland areas. So you can actually see in sediment when ocean sediment is by some force pushed inland. And that's what these people are studying in order to create a history of catastrophic hurricanes. That history will help us think about how do we predict catastrophic hurricanes today, when again we only have 4 Cat 5s to go off of, right? That's not a lot to get research from. So researching that sediment reveals that the first millennium of the North American continent, particularly Northeast, was frequently pounded by severe hurricanes. We don't see severe hurricanes there right now. But in the first millennium, there were 23 catastrophic hurricanes from 250 to 1150. Okay, that's about 1 every 40 years. The oceans were warm then, but the oceans are actually getting warmer now than they were then. So the tropical North Atlantic has surpassed those first millennium temperatures. Okay, so this means that what we're going to see is on New England's borders, with these hot temperatures, we might be seeing a Category 3 hurricane hitting New England every 10 years. Normally we see it 100 to 200 years. There have been very few catastrophic hurricanes to directly hit New England. So a Category 3 directly hitting a place like New England would be catastrophic. But what this shows us is with warming temperatures during the peak of the Roman Empire all the way to the Middle Ages, the Americas were getting pounded by these severe hurricanes, even in places we're not used to seeing hurricanes like New England. Okay, so that's what the Oceanographic Institute is showing us, that we are tracing now severe hurricanes that are associated with those warmer temperatures in the past. Okay, and we know that those warmer temperatures, according to this, are associated with CO2. Now, there's more. We have developed, or what is developing now, is this idea of paleotempestology, which is using geological evidence to document ancient hurricanes for the purpose of creating that bank of hurricane knowledge to prepare us for the future. So we have a little map here from research, from a researcher who's looking into hurricanes in the Gulf Coast particularly. The Oceanographic Institute was looking at hurricanes in New England. This is in the Gulf Coast, okay? You have all of these areas in the Gulf Coast. You see we have Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. I actually live, well, didn't live, but I own land like somewhere right there in Tangipahoa Parish. I love Louisiana. Anyway, so So here's the Gulf Coast, and here is the category, the potential of categories of catastrophic hurricanes hitting these places. Okay, we see that through these sediment, through looking at sediments in the Gulf Coast area, that catastrophic hurricanes hit each place on this map 10 to 12 times during the past 3,800 years. That means there's a catastrophic hurricane of a Category 5 level every 300 to 350 years in each of these places. That puts the probability of a Category 4 to 5 at 0.3%. So not high, right? When something is less common, it is harder to predict. Not the other way around. Okay? Okay. Now, when we think about prehistoric hurricanes, however, we actually have a good deal of documented evidence of these massive hurricanes. But they're not hurricanes, they're typhoons, because the longest documentary of typhoons is in China. We have a 4,000-year history of hurricanes written down in China that we just don't have here. I think I might have already said this, but I can't remember. Okay, but I have a nice little quote from one of these documents. So this is from 1633 AD, an excerpt from the Gazette of the Zhejiang province. I don't know how to pronounce this. Zhejiang? I don't know. Someone correct me. But in southeastern China. In the 6th lunar month of the 6th year of the Emperor Shangzhen, typhoon struck. As you can see, not hurricane, they use the word typhoon. Torrential rain fell for 10 days. Houses collapsed. Naval battleships were drifting in the sea. 8 or 9 out of 10 were destroyed, drowning numerous soldiers. Since the first year of Shangzhen, there was no year without typhoon strikes. The damage was especially serious this year. It was widely believed that the culprit was a mischievous dragon. Okay, so we have had so much record of typhoons or hurricanes in China that we just don't have here. So that's why that prehistoric research being done is so essential. We can look for written results. We have that geological evidence, but we also have written texts like these that China provides us. In addition, we can look at that through records from Spanish colonizers in South America and North America. Spanish, French, and English colonizers would have kept diaries. We have some information from plantation logs actually in the South, gives us some look into when hurricanes arrived. We do have information from lighthouses and oil rigs to some extent when there wasn't any national database that can give us a window into these hurricanes. But we just don't have this kind of written log that China does have. So what we do have is the Mayans, right? And that is where our beautiful hurricane gets its name. So I'm going to transition back to me now, and we're going to talk about the Popol Vuh once again. Now we discuss where we do see hurricanes presented in our own ancient history, and that is with the origin of the name hurricane that we use, which is the heart of sky, the Mayan god Huracan. He is the name that we use, and here is a depiction of him. You can see right here the Mayan god Huracan with his gusty winds. Okay, he is one of the essential gods who engaged in the conversation between water and sky that created people. Okay, like you and me. We were created from the mouth of the hurricane. Okay, so let's find out by reading the Popol Vuh. The language is really beautiful and poetic, so listen to the S sounds. If you're into poetry, that kind of consonants, the repetition of the S sound makes a very calming, water-like quality, so it's very beautifully written, this translation. So this is the account of the beginning of the world. This is the account. Here it is. Now it still ripples. Now it still murmurs. Ripples, it still sighs, still hums, and it is empty under the sky. Here follow the first words, the first eloquence. There is not yet one person, one animal, bird, fish, crab, tree, rock, hollow, canyon, meadow, forest. Only the sky alone is there. The face of the earth is not clear. Only the sea alone is pooled under all that sky. There is nothing whatever gathered together. It is at rest. Not a single thing stirs. It is held back, kept at rest under the sky. Whatever there is that might be is simply not there. Only the pooled water, only the calm sea, only it alone is pooled. So I love this depiction because it feels like what it really was, a world before our land masses formed in the way that they are, a world that was primarily water with no ice caps. If you think about this prehistoric time, the time before people, the water temperatures were much higher. I think the Pacific was at an ordinary temperature of above 100 degrees. So we don't have the polar ice caps. There's just more water. So they're not wrong in their depiction of how the earth began as this calm, placid water and this calm, placid sky from which the violence of people would emerge. I think it's fascinating to imagine people like hurricanes just blowing through, that we are a product of the hurricane's mind, that the hurricane wanted to create something that could speak to him, right? The hurricane, heart of sky, wished to create a person that could observe his concept of time and that could speak to him for the purpose of worshiping him. And so we, in this calm world, are the products of hurricane, and certainly we are as violent and affecting of change and capable of decimating things, but also growing things as a hurricane is. Okay, so let's continue. And of course, there is the sky, and there is also heart of sky. This is the name of the god as it is spoken. And so we are introduced to Huracan. And then came his word. He came here to the sovereign plumed serpent. That is the god of the seas. So we have two gods communicating with each other in a conversation. The earth, according to Mayan legend, began because of a conversation. It wasn't one man. It was a bunch of gods talking to each other, coming up with a consensus. So it's a very amiable way to begin the world, I think. Okay. He spoke with the sovereign plumed serpent, and they talked, then they fought. They talked, then they thought, then they worried. They agreed with each other. They joined their words, their thoughts. I love this. They talked, they thought, they worried. This is all people do. We talk, we think, and then we worry. So even the gods of this world are just sitting there worrying. I love that. It just feels so real to me, the Popol Vuh. Anyway, and they worried. They agreed with each other because of their worries. They joined their words, their thoughts. Then it was clear. Then they reached accord in the light, and then humanity was clear. Humanity comes out of agreement, just checking, not disagreement, consensus, worrying together. I hope that we do that we can worry together on this issue of hurricanes and climate change and come to a consensus that will create a new world, one that was better than the last. Anyway. Then humanity was clear when they conceived the growth, the generation of trees, of bushes, and the growth of life, of humankind in the blackness, in the early dawn, all because of the heart of sky named Hurricane. Thunderbolt Hurricane comes first, the second is newborn Thunderbolt, and the third is sudden Thunderbolt. So you have 3 little hurricane gods. So there were 3 of them as heart of sky who came to the sovereign plumed serpent when the dawn of life was conceived. How should the sowing be and the dawning? Who is to be the provider, nurturer? Now we're introduced to this idea of the sowing and the dawning. And I'm fascinated by this because it so much resembles that kind of deep ocean exchange, right? When things go in and then they come out, right? And of course it's based off of growing things, right? That you plant the seed, then the plant grows, and then you pull the seed, right? But it's also associated with human life cycles. So everything is a cycle. The sowing is the birth of the person, right? Oh, now I've confused myself. Let me look it up, because it's actually a little complex how the sowing and the dawning resembles life. It creates a circle. So let me flip through. Okay. So the sowing and the dawning is the process that they begin. So the sowing is when you are in the womb, right? Your sowing is you're planted before you are dawning with a light of birth. But the sowing is also burial in the earth. And that comes with a dawning, right? That dawning is when the soul becomes a spark of light in the darkness. So I love that idea, right? The destruction is not a death, but a sowing. Okay? The destruction is the planting of something. So when something egregious, monstrous, devastating like a hurricane comes through and destroys, what it leaves behind is planted to become a spark of light in the darkness. So it's a very different concept of death than I think that we have. A very different concept of the afterlife than we might have in Christian theology. But that idea of water and floods and punishment and rage comes in Christian theology in all of our in so many different theological texts. So this idea of massive storms of floods being this vengeance kind of thing is quite common. But this is a little bit different than vengeance, I think. Hurricane is communicating quite nicely to create people. Now, it does take him 4 tries to create people, and he gets really angry at the first 3 tries. So that's another thing. So Hurricane does do a lot of destroying. But as a god, he is bringing to life the sowing and the dawning, right? The life cycle. Very different than Adam and Eve biting the apple, and then original sin, and then going off and then learning about mortality and all of this thing and self-awareness. Very different than that. This is about a new process that has begun, which is that we are planted, we are born, and then we are planted again when we die. We go through 2 plantings in our life, the planting of our birth and the planting of our death. So it's very nice to think about. It's calming to me. But anyway, back to hurricanes. Okay, so I'll go Here's my notes. A lot to talk about. This is going to be a very long video. Okay. All right, what should I read next? Let's think about the different iterations of people that Hurricane creates, because he does kill one of them in a flood. Very sad. Okay. So let's go to 70 in our Papafu. Are you asleep yet? Maybe. This one's a bit chaotic, I think. I'm going to go in a lot of different directions. That's okay. Okay. Here we go. Where did we do the first one? So the first people that they created were basically animals. They were these little things that could move around and they could do all these things, but they couldn't speak, right? So the goal of creating people was to praise the gods, right? That's why, and to keep time. So you see that in Mayan culture, time is so important. They were to praise the gods and they were to keep time. So the first they created were the animals, but when they opened their mouths to speak, they could not speak the language of the gods. The gods wanted people that could speak to them, right? But when the animals, they just screeched and scratched and blah, blah, blah. So he said, you are doomed to be eaten. Doomed to be eaten. And that's how the animals came to be. Now the second were made out of mud. They tried again, and they made people out of mud. But the problem was they couldn't move. They just dissolved. The second they sat on earth, they just like dissolved into this sad little slop. So they're like, that doesn't work either. And then they went to two old women gods, basically, the midwife and the matchmaker. And these women were great, you had the powers of divination. So they could look at the past lunar cycles and planetary cycles, and they could see into the past and then see into the future. And they said, okay, make these people. And they made people out of wood. But the problem with the people of wood is that they could speak. They had no souls, they had no love, they had no appreciation. So they had, quote, nothing in their minds, no memory of their mason and builder. They did not remember the heart of sky. So the people who did not remember Hurricane, who did not know of him, who were not aware of his power, who dared to assume or pretend that they had his power, were destroyed in a flood, right? That Hurricane brought against them. And not only did he bring a flood, he had all of the belongings of these wooden people rise up against them. Their houses crushed them, right? So let's go to 72, which is a depiction of the type of destruction that a hurricane can bring. 72. He destroyed those who attempted to mimic his power. I take down that seltzer water real quick. This is the drink of the gods. Okay. So, one of the people that he needed to destroy most was Seven Macaw. Now, Seven Macaw was the false light. Okay. This is what he said. I am great. My place is now higher than that of human work, the human design. I am their sun and I am their light, and I am also their months. So be it. My light is great. I am the walkway and I am the foothold of the people because my eyes are of metal. My teeth just glitter with jewels and turquoise as well. They stand out blue as stones like the face of the sky. And this nose of mine shines white into the distance like the moon. I want to draw your attention to the word metal and the glittering teeth, right? I draw your attention to that because it's so similar, that kind of language, to the machine, right? To this kind of creation of a technology that could replace that of the natural world. Very machine-like in nature. And he is the thing who believes that he can be the light above these larger powers. It boasts a hubris, right, that people have, and perhaps our tendency to believe that we can outwit a hurricane is hubris. Perhaps we are those wooden people. I don't know. But so often those who believe that they're greater than they are destroyed. And perhaps it is an act of hubris to put our worlds in these very vulnerable places. And the number one act of hubris that I think we can pull from is probably the Galveston Hurricane of 1900. So let's go briefly to Galveston before I return and talk about the Popol Vuh and the depiction of destruction, okay, of what our darling Heart of Sky did to his wooden people. Galveston, 1900, the United States' most deadly hurricane to date, killed 8,000 people, though some say that the count would probably be closer to 10,000 people. So, why was this hurricane a question of hubris? Let's find out. It is, what I'm going to read from is Gulf by Jack E. Davis, an excellent book about the making of the Gulf Coast and of the Gulf of Mexico, the sea. Okay. So this is how Galveston came about and how they prepared themselves for devastation. Essentially, every act that they made was making it more and more likely that a hurricane would annihilate them. Michael B. Menard, a 31-year-old Quebec-born Indian trader and timber cutter, settled the island in 1836 as his private enterprise. With all the Easterners and immigrants rushing to farm the Great Plains of the North, more commerce was sure to come along down the Trinity River. No one seemed to doubt that Galveston's future lay in a busy port. From that point on, the island was always about money and growth. Two key words that something bad is going to happen. Whenever you hear money and people were putting everything on money, something devastating happens after. Literally every time. When will we learn? Okay. So, Galveston, wrote Stephen Crane, who visited the city 5 years before the storm, has always been substantial and undeviating in its amount of business. Now, the problem is Galveston wasn't a port, right? It wasn't physically a port city. It didn't have a port. Its average bay depth was 7 feet, right? You can't fit a ship. We all know that. You can't fit a ship, a cargo ship, into a 7-foot bay. Okay, so that's what Galveston has. It has a good deal of gradual incline, incline from the seafloor up to the island. Okay, that's good. That would protect you from a hurricane, right? Like a natural marshland. You need that when a hurricane's going to come pummeling down your way. But they wanted that money. They wanted that successful port. So they also wanted to kind of beat New Orleans and beat Houston, right? In business. So they commissioned the construction of a jetty of about 13 feet. But 13 feet's not enough, right? You still need to get those big cargo ships in. You need at least 30 feet. So they ended up forming a deep water committee and petitioning President Cleveland of the time to donate some money, a federal grant, to create a port. And that they were able to build a 30-foot port for the city of Galveston. Okay? It made Galveston the busiest port in the country, and in the year before 1900, it hit 86 million in foreign exports. So a really successful port. Now here comes the hurricane of 1900, which no one was prepared for due to a bureau mistake, right? The government's meteorology team made a mistake. And this happens so often in the 20th century when it comes to big hurricanes. People just make one calculation a little bit wrong and completely mess up their predictions for a hurricane. So Isaac Klein is the chief of the U.S. Weather Bureau in the Galveston station at the time of the hurricane. There are no planes or radar to track storms. The first time a plane would actually fly into a storm's eye or a hurricane's eye was not until World War II, when a pilot was training British soldiers on a particular plane, and there was a hurricane coming, and that pilot, they had to get these planes off, because when hurricanes come, they can do severe damage to military equipment. So like, we have to get these planes out of the way. The British did not want to evacuate all these planes. They thought the planes were crap. They didn't like the planes. This is the story. And so this guy was like, you know what? This plane isn't crap. I love this plane. I'm going to show you that this plane isn't crap. And so he said, I'm going to fly this plane into the hurricane. And so he does it. And he was the first one to fly the plane into the eye of a hurricane and come out. And now we have hurricane trackers that go into those hurricanes and get our wind temperatures and get all sorts of essential tracking data, right? Thanks to that guy who did that one flight in World War II, which again, everything goes back to military. But it's like kind of the locus of all of our production and all of our improvements seems to come from military technology. But anyway, Galveston did not have that, right? We did not have any people flying into the hurricanes, detected wind speeds, or no one was in the eye of the hurricane. So when we think about this hurricane, there just wasn't anything. You had these people like Isaac Klein who had their own contacts, and that was really, really essential in the meteorology world. You want to make sure that you had people that you got information from. And where Isaac Klein was getting information, you have your oil rigs, you have your fishermen, you have your people on their boats, you have your lighthouses, all of these places that are giving information. And so you have information coming from the centralized bureau through the government, but then you have Isaac Klein who's kind of off doing his own thing, right? So this is what he was told on Friday, September 7th. They said that it was a relatively harmless tropical storm, was moving up through the Gulf and would fishtail over northern Florida and into the Atlantic. The East Coast stations had been put on alert, but not those in the Gulf, so they completely messed up where it was going. Then, just that morning, Washington changed the position of the storm to south of Louisiana, though they were still calling a moderate one. Now, here's the problem. Cuba just got hit by this hurricane and called us up and said, hey, this is not a normal hurricane, this is huge, right? It dumped an unusually large amount of water, and they said, this is moving towards Texas. But unfortunately, at this time, the Cuban-United States relationship was marked by racism, and United States looked down on Cubans, and so did not take their word seriously. And the U.S. Weather Bureau in Cuba reported to Washington that a weakening tropical storm was entering the Gulf, when in fact it was a strengthening one. Okay? The Category 4 hurricane drew towards Klein, and people actually drove or walked to the beach to like admire the surf that was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, not knowing that a Category 4 hurricane was approaching. And so, again, 8,000 people died that day. Breakers began pounding the bathhouses and piers into pieces, ripping out the creosoted street blocks, turning them into floating torpedoes. Horrified spectators backed away and dashed home. By 1 p.m., high water and wind had submerged the bridge and 3 trestles. Minutes after, the train from Houston crossed over the island and relinquished panic-stricken weekenders, disembarking onto a drowning island. So they literally arrived on the island while it was being barraged by this hurricane. And so that was so much hubris, right? It was United States hubris, not listening to those in Cuba. It was this idea that we could create a bustling port out of an area that is not made to be a port. You're essentially bringing in all of this water. You're taking away the Earth's natural protections against these hurricanes. All of this is happening, which then causes this kind of mass devastation to the area. And so let's go back to the Popol Vuh real quickly and think about how that resembles what Huracan did to his little wooden people at 72. It's quite a punishment. They were pounded down to the bones and tendons, smashed and pulverized even to bones. Okay, this is of the wooden people. This is called a humiliation, destruction, and demolition. The mannequins and wood carvings were killed when the Heart of Sky devised a flood for them. A great flood was made. It came down on the heads of the mannequins, the wood carvings. Their faces were smashed because they were incompetent before their mother and their father, the Heart of Sky, named Hurricane. The earth was blackened because of this. The black rainstorm began, rain all day and rain all night. Into their houses came the animals, small and great. Their faces were crushed by things of wood and stone. Everything spoke. Their water jars, their tortilla griddles, their plates, their cooking pots, their dogs, their grinding stones, each and everything crushed their faces. The dogs and turkeys told them, "You caused us pain, you ate us, but now it is you whom we shall eat. And this is the grinding stone. We were undone because of you. Every day, in the dark, in the dawn, forever. Rip, rip, rub, rub, right in our faces because of you." This was the service we gave you at first when you were still people, but today you will learn of our power. We shall pound and we shall grind your flesh, the grinding stones told them. They want to climb up on the houses, but they fall as the houses collapse. They want to climb the trees. They're thrown off by the trees. They want to get inside caves, slam shut, but the caves slam shut in their faces. Such was the scattering of the human work, the human design. The people were ground down, overthrown. The mouths and faces of all of them were destroyed and crushed. And it used to be said that the monkeys in the forest today are a sign of this. They were left as a sign because wood alone was used for their flesh by the builder and the sculptor. So that is the depiction of Hurricane's destruction. And it is very, very accurate, I think, to how it feels and how everything in a hurricane turns against you. The homes that you built and that you loved become weapons, right? They become dangerous. They collapse beneath you. Your possessions become projectiles. I mean, everything turns against you. That is the representation there. But one thing, I think there is a positive note. I am hesitant to cast, right, the hurricane as some sort of divine punishment, because it's not, right? It's not. But what we can draw from the Popol Vuh, I think, is that idea of sowing and drawing, right? Is that from these hurricanes, if we listen to them, right? If we listen to them, we are capable of creating a world in which we can avoid these hurricanes, we can stop them, we can build a world that can withstand them. But we have to listen to them. You know what I mean? I think that we have to do what Hurricane did when he created people, which is we have to come to a consensus. We have to come to an agreement. And that is something that we so struggle to do now, right? I think we're getting closer because we're starting to agree on facts again in regards to climate change, but something that needs to happen, right, is the kind of agreement the Hurricane had with his plumed serpent. And then this is how we create people. But he tried 4 times, right? It's going to take so many tries. But we can do it as long as we don't have that hubris that says we can create this thing for monetary gain. We can create this masterpiece. And we don't have to worry about all the changes we've made to the natural cycles of the world and how those might end up obliterating us. We can create in times of peace, not knowing all the ways in which we destroy the mechanisms that have made that peace possible. When we, shall we say, capitalize on a peaceful time, we don't realize how that act of capitalization will make that peacefulness impossible to maintain. That makes sense. I think that's what we can determine from the ancient history of our region. Right? The ancient history, the creation myth that brought us the Popol Vuh is saying to us, this region is spectacularly unstable when it comes to hurricanes. This is how we live with them. So we now talk the hurricanes after the first contact, after the settlers found the New World. And their encounters with these hurricanes were catastrophic. They actually decided who controlled certain regions. For instance, Spain and France both attempted to colonize Florida, but a hurricane ended up annihilating France's firepower that they had put on a ship and allowed and gave Spain the opportunity to then destroy the French colony, essentially putting Spain in control of La Florida at the time over the French. And so many histories were defined by these hurricanes that would blow ships off course and lead them to different areas. These hurricanes were described in settlers' books like so. Such a storm came up with such heavy winds that the Indians assured me that it was the worst storm to ever come to the coast. And then a 4-day hurricane described by a man of the name Sir Francis Drake said it had great spouts at the seas as though heaven and earth would have met. So you see, those are the kinds of descriptions that these settlers came with when they encountered these Gulf of Mexico hurricanes, which are just on another level. Okay. And then we go up into the plantation logs. Plantation logs show us so much about what hurricanes were like at the time. And so I'll read from a plantation log that gives us a brief look into hurricanes at this time period, if I could only find it. This is a diary from this woman here. You can see her picture on a plantation. And she wrote, her name was Serena Hale. On August 29th, 1880, she wrote, Sunday 29th, hard wind and hard rain, early in the morning, windy all night, rainy and windy all day, uncomfortable, continued rain and wind all day, raw, terrible wind at night, rain continued, not hard but steady, sideways, dogwood tree blown down. Monday morning, 30th, wind blowing hard still at 9 o'clock and rain. No prospect of abating storm raging. Terrible, terrible. 6 o'clock p.m., storm still raging, has been raging furiously all day. Trees falling constantly. Almost equal to storm August 17th, 18th, 19th, 1871. The wind spent its fury and ceased about 12 o'clock Monday night, August 30th, having raged for 48 hours. The rain also stopped before daylight, sideways cotton crop hurt. So she was describing a hurricane that hit Florida between Palm Beach and Cocoa Beach on August 29th, 1880. and moved across the state, dumping heavy rain before exiting into the Gulf of Mexico just south of Cedar Key. It had winds that exceeded 125 miles an hour, according to Florida Hurricanes, which was a Weather Bureau report published in 1933. It killed 68 people. Okay, and so these are one of the ways that researchers can start to track these storms, is by looking at these diaries from this woman who lived on a plantation, or probably a plantation owner of some kind, and wrote down these details. You can also see, this is a photograph of Bay Street in downtown Beaufort, South Carolina, very close to where I used to live. This was 1893. A picture of the devastation that a hurricane wrought on the city. It's amazing how long we have been rebuilding these areas on the Gulf Coast. We have been decimated, we rebuild. We are decimated, we rebuild. I mean, it goes back hundreds of years. This tenacity of people to stay where they love. And I think there's something noble in that. So that is a picture. Speaking of this, I'll end on this note, because this has gotten to be such a long video, because it kind of connects past to present in a way. Have any of you heard of the Gray Man? He originated, I can't remember, 1822, I think, was the first sighting of the Gray Man. And he was sighted as far as recently as Hurricane Ian. People said that they saw the Gray Man. The Gray Man is allegedly a ghostly figure that will warn people of an approaching hurricane. He tells people of places that will be devastated by it so they can leave and save themselves and their things. And the story started because of a hurricane in 1822. A man who was going to visit his fiancée a few days or weeks before the hurricane, I'm not sure, ended up dying. He was trapped in quicksand, and the quicksand killed him. And this is in South Carolina. This is a South Carolina legend that has kind of spread throughout the entire Gulf Coast. So the Gray Man is essentially the ghost of this fiancé who died on the way to see his lover. And allegedly, after he died, she saw him days later, right before the hurricane, and he was warning his fiancée of the approaching hurricane so she could leave. And a ton of people died in that hurricane of 1822, but he allegedly saved her life by appearing as a gray, shadowy figure. There have been alleged sightings of this gray, shadowy figure on beaches across South Carolina, the East Coast, and the Gulf Coast. Allegedly, this man comes to warn us, as he warned his lover, of danger approaching, to save her and to save our lives. So it's a tragic story, but the Gray Man is a warning. So if you see the Gray Man on the beach, you know that a hurricane is coming, right? It's one of those myths, legends that goes as far back as 1822. With these hurricanes we have been experiencing and rebuilding from since the beginning of time. Since the beginning of Mayan time, since the moment that Huracan created his people and said, "You will live by my calendar and you will worship me with your words." So that is a brief, not so brief, maybe very brief history of the American hurricane. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're asleep. And if you're not, go watch the other Popol Vuh video for more information on Mayan culture if you're interested in that. Okay, thank you so much for watching. I love spending time with you, and have a wonderful night or day or whatever it is you're about to do. Bye-bye, and thank you.